modeling just one thing, rather than giving them a whole variety of patterns to kind of build on, integrate with each other. So, I'm going to speak to you specifically about a project that we've done. I guess we've done them in junior highs, high schools, junior highs, high schools, undergraduate and graduate level. We've done this project. And the goal of the project is different in each one of these settings, but pretty much it's to teach people how to use microcontrollers and do kind of maker activities. And it's slightly tweaked for each audience that we're working with. So for design patterns, the first thing that we do is show them a whole variety of art and technology. And this is Natalie Jeremchenko's robotic environmental dogs. So they hacked into a bunch of robotic dogs and put sensors on them so they could go out and sniff environmental dangers. It's pretty adorable when you see the whole crew of people with their dogs go out. This is applied autonomy. This up here is a robot that they built. It's a graffiti robot that they would send out on the streets during protests to write graffiti in the middle of the protest, and then the cops would get pretty mad because they had no idea who was controlling this little robot. And that was all part of the art, right? Part of the conceptualization there. We also showed them a lot of examples, because the project ended up centering on this, on Day of the Dead. Celebrations and the way that different people sort of mark Day of the Dead. How many of you are acquainted with Day of the Dead? Kind of, sort of, a little. So, Day of the Dead, wait, is it today? It was yesterday. Yesterday. Oh. It was yesterday. I've never given a talk so close to the date. So it is a day that is marked particularly by Latin American and Central American cultures to sort of mark and celebrate the lives of people who have died over the last year, and even people who had died further back than that. It's one day that the community comes together and sort of acknowledges this death and celebrates the life of these people. And there's a whole variety of ways. A lot of it is done with this kind of skull imagery and skeleton imagery, and also a lot of bright colors. They build altars, and just little altars inside their home, or sometimes really big altars. Oftentimes there are parades with, music and these giant puppets, and people will carry decorated fake coffins through the street. This sounds really morbid. It's actually quite festive, quite frankly. And then they also do a lot of puppet making. And this is, some really interesting puppets that have been made around the celebration. So that was the pattern strategy. We showed them a wide variety of examples, many more than I just showed you. And then there's also component strategy. So similar to like Lego blocks that you put together, what you want people to do is make those little blocks first, right? Then they can fit together in different configurations. So oftentimes we start these projects having them make these little blocks without knowing what the final product is, right? So in this case, we asked them to write a little bit about someone in their lives that has died. You guys can't read any of that, can you? So, like the first question asks, who's someone important to you that's died? And then we ask, why are they important to you, and how their death impacted you? We ask them to tell us a story about the person that they're celebrating, and then some symbolic representation about that person. So some people chose coins, or some people chose hats, or other things that might represent that person. And then what things the person that you celebrated, let me read it here, it's a little easier. So what are the things that the person you were celebrating reacted to from the world around them? And how could you physically sort of create that? So we're setting them up to build small components that then we want to have them put together. And just so you know, we didn't actually, some people wrote about someone very important to them who had died. There were some tears in some of the classes on occasion. But a lot of people wrote about a character in a book that had died, or someone wrote about their phone dying, which I thought was quite a clever take on the whole thing. But we weren't forcing people to talk about this emotional experience, and some people chose to and some people didn't. But we also wanted to make sure they thought about how death was represented within their own culture and how it was marked within their own culture. We weren't asking them to reproduce another culture, but to find ways to sort of express what was going on in their own culture in a new way. And actually it was probably, for me as a teacher, the most fun to teach it with the graduate class because the graduate classes had so many different nationalities represented, and it was kind of amazing to hear the students sharing sort of their cultural backgrounds in ways that we rarely ever hear in the College of Computing. So for me as an educator, that was extremely fun. So they have all these components, and the next thing we do is give them a format, sort of a predefined solution for how to put those components together. And we want to make sure they're pretty flexible because those components get built out in very different ways. So in this case, the format is a pretty typical storyboard that might be used for developing interactive physical computing, where you talk about a start state for some sort of an object, talk about an input, an output, and then the final piece. So in this case, this is my grandmother Blanche, who was a very, very proper Southern lady. That's a good way to put it. She was very proper, and she always wanted to make sure that everyone was acting correctly. And she was always telling me to be more of a lady. I still haven't really become much of a lady, but so she died of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, long before it sort of has gotten this attention within the media. And I originally made this when the Ice Bucket Challenge was going on. Do you guys remember the Ice Bucket Challenge? Okay, so to raise money or awareness of ALS, people were dumping buckets of ice over their head, videotaping it and posting it on Facebook. She would have hated that, totally hated it, because she would have seen it as wasteful and stupid and not really raising money. And so the output for her was going to be that these things would light up. Every time, if I scrape my Facebook page, every time somebody mentioned the Ice Bucket Challenge, it would trigger an output, which would be lights lighting up on her hat. And then the final state for this is, on her hat, it says money, not ice, or dollars, not ice. I'm not really sure what the message would be at the end. It's not super clever, but this is the kind of format that we want people to model, right? By taking the components from their worksheet and putting it together. And what's interesting about it is that the students, if we just asked them to make an interactive puppet, would have had a much harder time structuring these things and putting them together. But because we're giving them this kind of format, it was easier for them. For our graduate students, it was easier for them because they had a hard time being creative, quite honestly. Creative might be the wrong word. They had a hard time breaking out of this mold that everything they made had to be functional, right? These are human-computer interaction designers. All they want to do is make functional items. And some of them didn't have any problem, but some of them really had a problem breaking out of this. But because we gave them the worksheet first, they had to. They felt like they had to follow through with what was on the worksheet. And then for our, for like the junior high and high school students that we've worked with, the interesting thing about this is that this actually pushed them to do far more complex technology than they would have otherwise. Because the answer that we get when we ask them to make something after they know only a little bit about electronics is they always make the simplest thing. But because they had done all this work ahead of time, they were ready to start building things that were more complex. So it pushed them outside their comfort zone and motivated them because it was personally meaningful for them. So finally, what we implemented was also protocols. So anytime you have a social context, which is any kind of a classroom, you have these agreements for how people act within that classroom. So we had the students do a lot of this work, sitting on the floor or just spreading out all over the tables. It was very arts and craftsy feeling. And that wasn't necessarily unusual with the high school students or junior high students we were working with. It was pretty different than what most of our graduate students experience inside their classrooms. So we set a new sort of protocol for how things should happen. And then we also had them post their work and walk around and do critiques. So how do critiques work within music? How does that work? I don't know, I've never studied music at all. Well, I mean, I played the piano from 6 to 10, but that was it. Do you guys have critiques? You have to.
I think our most similar one is technology ensemble or project studio, where we're kind of like, it's more informal, but you're kind of making a piece or a composition, and then like maybe weekly you have an opportunity where people kind of see you do it and then respond. But
Okay.
it's not like in the art world, I don't think.
It's not, is it not super formal or?
It's not formal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think in the art world it can be really informal. So like when the students were working here, I was walking around the room the entire time giving critiques to each, each table and each individual kind of person working on this. So in that way, that's similar. But I mean, it's the same thing. You have a very set kind of protocol for how people interact with each other, and it's not this formal piece. And that's the protocol for your setting. So what we were trying to do is set up a similar sort of protocol where there'd be some informal, and then we had a little bit more formal presentations where we did pinups, but this is actually far less formal than most of the time you'll see in computing. Most of the time in computing, nobody shows anything until they show their final work to the whole class, right? It's that final poster session. But instead, we're encouraging people to show stuff, even in that first draft, in that first iteration, and getting feedback. And at first, we let the students give all the feedback, and then the professor comes in and starts giving feedback as well. And this is important in terms of protocol because it's quite different than the normal process these students are used to in computing, and even in high school too, because most of the time people are used to this kind of setup where everybody's sitting there and I'm showing slides and talking to you, right? So this is really a different thing for these students. So at the end of the day, when designing meta design, one of the advantages is that it's very highly value driven. The students were bringing their own values because they were working on things from their own experience in their own past, sometimes really pretty personal things. High as far as value driven, but really kind of middle of the road in terms of low structure to high structure. So sometimes one has a very high structured curriculum where everybody does everything exactly as planned. There's also these very open-ended curriculum where a constructionist approach, as it's called, where I would just throw a bunch of tools out to you guys and ask you to make something. Meta design really scaffolds that design process. So I could give you lots of different tools, but I give you some structure for how to put that together. And while we follow this kind of 4 steps of infrastructuring, one could imagine doing things in very different ways, but having some structure there for the students. So the last example of participatory design I'm going to show you is a project that we've done, a method that we've developed called medium probes. And I want to give a little motivation to this first, is that because I work in informal education, I work with lower income populations often, I've been looking at the fact that there's all these amazing tools online for learning, and a lot of them have this explicit goal that it's education for everyone. They're going to help solve the education disparities in our country. But the reality is that kids from well-educated and wealthy families use these educational tools far more frequently than kids from low-income, low-education families. And it's actually creating a larger educational divide into our schools and creating a bigger division as far as kids are tracked in the schools between the accelerated students and the lower, less accelerated students. So all of these educational tools, with the best of intention they've been designed, actually are hurting kind of equality in our country. So I have been trying to look at how access to online resources impact parents selecting informal learning opportunities for their kids. Because at the end of the day, kids go to have certain experiences with education because their parents select it for them, or their parents encourage them to go there, right? If you don't have parents sort of pushing some of this, it doesn't happen. So I looked at how low-income parents particularly are accessing online resources, and I end up talking almost exclusively to moms because dads don't talk about this stuff with researchers, even though we asked a lot of them. So we look at, past work shows that access to online resources for families can improve public health, general parenting, skills, and we believe educational outcomes. But access is complicated by a lot of issues. Some is technical issues. People don't know how to use technology or they don't have the technological means. Some of it is about trust and fear. So a lot of parents actually limited the amount of the places that their kids could go online based off of these issues around trust and fear. And some of it is about social ties. So if you have a very homogeneous sort of population that you're interacting with most of the time, they're going to tell you about the same resources and the same sites. Everybody's going to be telling you the same thing. If you have a very heterogeneous social network, then you're going to hear about all sorts of different resources. And within low-income communities, it's been shown that parents have very homogeneous kind of networks, where almost everybody they're talking to is sort of in the same boat as them. So they don't have new or different information. So in all of these talks with parents, because we were spending a lot of time with them, we conducted 60 interviews with parents asking about their access to informal educational resources. Moms particularly love to talk about parenting. They were super open with us about a lot of different issues. But every time we talked to them about technology, they were like, oh no, I don't do technology, I'm not a tech person. That was almost always the response that we got from all of the moms. And some of this, we realized, was because we were researchers from Georgia Tech, and they saw us as experts in technology, and they felt themselves to be somehow less than us, and they didn't even want to start that conversation. We think in fear that they might not look smart, right? So they just backed out of the conversation completely. So we're really trying to understand what kind of medium we can provide to them to get them to access informal learning resources, but they wouldn't talk to us about it. So we've been thinking about things like computers, phones, even paper and ink. Like, should we use flyers rather than digital information? And we also were thinking about format. Do we provide them with a database? Is it a list? Is it a narrative that they're able to access this information? That really matters in terms of the medium that you select. I will tell you what our guesses were before we started this, is that we really thought that it would be a phone and a database, right? We really thought that we were going to build an app that they could search for things that were applicable to their kids. And even knowing we went in with that bias, we built upon a different kind of method called cultural probes. Are any of you acquainted with cultural probes? Okay, so cultural probes are these little packages. Oftentimes they're very precious packages that they have been designed very specifically to elicit sort of new information from people. And they frequently do that by asking people to say, answer a question every day in this journal, or take a photograph and then respond to this, or every time you eat, tell us how you're feeling. So the reason why they're kind of precious is because people wouldn't do this unless they felt like it was fun or special or something like that. And the goal of these is not to gather generalizable information, but to gather inspiration for design and to understand the everyday practices of people. So this is much of what we were looking for, was inspiration for design and everyday practices, but we knew just asking straight out questions about technology wouldn't work. So instead, we asked them questions about parenting because we knew they would be happy to answer those questions. But we asked them to respond to those questions in different ways every day, and this was over the course of a week. So we gave them a phone number that they could call in and leave a voicemail. We gave them a phone number for texting. We gave them a paper journal, a disposable camera, a little USB audio recorder, so if they just wanted to audio record their response, a Twitter account that we had set up with them, it was anonymous, and a Tumblr account for each one of them. And they had these for a week, and there's a little brochure that had all these different questions on it, and we sent it home with them and then collected it back a couple weeks later and talked to them in focus groups about, the experience. We found that they were really eager to talk to us about technology at this point because they had this firsthand experience that we were asking about. They were totally capable of sharing because they were experts on their own experience, right? We also found that most of them preferred writing in the journals not because they wanted to write in the journal. As you can see, some of them actually typed up their answers and then cut them out and pasted them into the journal. They actually preferred typing their answers out. But they wanted to use a journal because they wanted to tell stories. And the journal was the best way to tell stories. Now, only 2 of them tried Tumblr, and the ones that did try Tumblr, they said that was their favorite thing, and it was the best way to tell their stories. But most of them really were interested in this narrative piece. The other thing that we found is the reason why only 2 of them tried Tumblr or Twitter is because they didn't trust much of the sites that they see on the internet. And there was a couple issues here. One was that they were really frightened of malware, right? If it wasn't a very trusted source, they didn't want to go to it. Because when you have one computer for a family of 6, if that thing goes down, it's a big deal, right? It's not like you can just swap it out real quick. And it's not like they necessarily had the skills to fix it if something happened. So they were very concerned about this. The other thing that they were concerned about when it came to using those kinds of social media sites like Tumblr or Twitter was that they kept telling us things like, I'm not a tech person pretty much. So like with the Tumblr and Twitter, I don't do that at all. And they kept telling us these things like, I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a tech person when we talk to them about Facebook. Now they might have a Facebook account, but they didn't regularly interact with it. And as we kind of dug into this, we started to understand that they thought that these social media sites weren't really built for them, because most of the women we were talking to were low-income African-American women, and they didn't necessarily feel like these were built for them. And like this is a Slingshot, was a product Facebook put out like 2 years ago. You just look at this ad. This ad isn't for them. They're right. Facebook is not built for them. They aren't misinterpreting this. So, looking at that, we kind of came to the conclusion that we need to focus on narrative as a method or a format for delivering our information. But we also need to be able to do that on the computer. And we need to make sure that the medium that we use isn't some sort of standardized social media that has this kind of stigmatism to them of belonging to a different audience, right? So we do think that what needs to be done is that and we're working on this right now, we're working with ACT, the large testing company, building out a social media section of their site, so it's from a trusted company, and it can be they can be referred to it from their schools, because they were willing to look at sites that the schools referred them to. But it could be built around kind of the way that these people want to talk in this narrative format, rather than in a database or a list, which is how most of the information about informal education is delivered right now. So right now we're working on and testing that, going forward. We're also doing some smaller scale studies over in the west side with really locally based groups, which we're building out of the Parent-Teacher Association. Seeing if maybe the ground-up approach works better than a top-down approach from the larger site of ACT. You guys don't know what ACT is? It's the test that you take to get into college, like SAT. It's a big company. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And they have lots and lots of parents. So that's nice for us because we can test these things with large quantities of parents. So I'm going to briefly go over this stuff. I'm not going to go over it a lot. So one of the challenges of participatory design in human-computer interaction or design of learning technologies is that most people look at participatory design as, this is somebody else's quote, who I'm not referencing here, unfortunately it should be, is just add users and stir. But if you see, a lot of the things that I've shown you today isn't really about just going up to the people who you consider your participants and saying, how should I design this? Because they can't really answer that question, right? You're scaffolding a design experience for them so that they can help you, and also so that you can learn the vocabulary that they're speaking and kind of the experiences that they have to better understand that situation. I oftentimes see participatory design as giving me breaking down barriers, developing a shared vocabulary, and then finally scaffolding it so that my participants can be designers too, right? So what I want to end with is just how learning with participatory design is happening. And this has a lot to do with this scaffolding experience. So oftentimes with the things that I've been describing today or other participatory design activities, you can see what we're actually trying to do is trigger prior knowledge that people have them reflect on their own experience, have them think about things that they know in one context and apply it to another, that kind of transfer. And all of these things are actually theories of how people learn. And because of that, they're all actually tied to this idea of metacognition. Knowing what you know in participatory design is extremely important because knowing what you know allows you to share that with other people. We have all sorts of intrinsic heuristics for how to operate in the world that we don't even know how to articulate or even know that we have until somebody asks us to step back and look at that. So I did a survey of all the papers in the Computer Human Interaction Conference, CHI. Do you guys, any of you go to CHI or know about CHI? I know you do. You don't. You do?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a really big conference in human-computer interaction. And I did a survey of all the papers that use participatory design as their keywords, and I found there's 120 papers, around 60 of them actually did participatory design. The other ones just went and asked somebody, help me design this. And then I looked through them to see if I could identify some of these learning theories. And while there are a lot of different kind of learning theories that were being used by these researchers and designers, there was 3 that sort of stood out the most to me. I don't know why this is supposed to be black text. But anyway, this says reflection, zones of proximal development, and pre-existing knowledge. And those were kind of the 3 theories that I identified the most often. So I'm going to speak to these really briefly. So reflection is pretty much what it sounds like. It's taking that step back and reflecting on some sort of practice within your life, right? So there was one example paper that I pulled out as a really nice example of this. This was with these CIA analysis analyst folks that they had been working with, and they couldn't go into work practices because that would be illegal. So instead, what they did was they gave them problems, fake sort of crises and fake sort of data to support or refute that crisis, and asked them to perform this on stage, right? And in this, a lot of participatory design is this performative experience. Because as soon as you're on stage doing this in front of other people, I'm starting to think about what you see, right? I'm starting to think about what the audience sees when I'm up performing, right? And that is a reflective practice. And it's one of those practices we see again and again, this performance piece in participatory design. They don't identify it as reflective practice. They don't look at the learning theory most of the time in HCI about reflective practices. And I think that they could design it better if they did, frankly. Oh, that was my example from my paper. The other practice is pre-existing knowledge. And so this is something that we saw both positive and negative impacts on participatory design. This was a project that was participatory design of a home entertainment center and electronics center, right? And what they found was they had developed these kind of participatory design groups, because usually you do them in small groups, kind of these activities. They had scheduled them so all the really high-tech folks, well-educated in technology kind of people came to one session, people with less experience with technology came to other sessions. But there was some mix-up or scheduling issues, so a few of the high-tech groups had 1 or 2 people who had really very little experience with technology. And what they found was the pre-existing knowledge that the technologists had when it was all technologists in the room just made them kind of run in circles. They weren't really coming up with anything new because they kept proposing the same ideas that they already knew worked, right? But when they introduced 1 or 2 people who had almost no experience, they asked a question, which is why? Well, why would that be? Why does that have to be? And that basically made them step out for a moment from their pre-existing knowledge and be able to sort of focus to see what was important. And they felt that those groups the heterogeneous groups were far more effective than the more homogeneous groups. So this is, yeah, a quote from that. All right, and the final one is zones of proximal development. How many of you know what zones of proximal development are? Anybody? Okay, so zones of proximal development is, we all know like this much stuff in the world, right? And then there's another bigger circle that talks about all the stuff we could possibly know based off of where we're at right now, right? And all these things I could possibly know in this outside band, with a little help, with a little nudge, with some support, I could learn those things. But then once you go way outside of that, you end up in this situation where you can't even learn that stuff because you just don't have enough background. Like no matter how much help you get, you can't learn it. You have to build your way up to it. So at any given time, we have a zone of proximal development, the zone where we can possibly learn things. So actually I'm going to talk about one of my projects instead. So with the glitch game testers, there was one PD activity that we did that was a total failure. We asked the young men that we were working with that day to make a CD case for the perfect video game, their ideal video game if they could go out and make one, and had all the money in the world to do it. And we thought they would love it, and they did enjoy it. They had a good time doing it, but they ended up designing basically the games that already exist with tiny little changes, right? So it was Mortal Kombat. Basically, that was the game that they designed with some tiny little tweak to it so that it was different kinds of people fighting, or it was Madden except for high school, right? These kinds of things. Just not very creative, and I didn't get any new information from them. And I think because I was trying to ask them to do something that was outside of their zone of proximal development. Designing a game is super hard, right? And doing creative things with game design is really difficult. And I was just pushing them a little too far. The interesting thing is a couple years into Glitch, I asked the young men in Glitch, some of which were actually the same young men, to do that same activity. And the range and sort of their creativity was much greater within that group. I still don't think any of them came up with like a killer game, but it was much more creative kind of results from that. And I think it's because we had them, after 2 years of working as game testers, they were really working within their zone of proximal development to think about what new games could look like and what new games can be. They had that kind of experience. This is an example of another paper where they had the exact kind of opposite problem, where they had brought in their graduate students to be their participants, and the graduate students all knew way too much about the project, and so they just weren't able to produce anything. They weren't pushing themselves outside of their zone of proximal development. So these three sort of approaches, formative participatory design that gets at values, meta design, and the medium probes, are just kind of three approaches that one could take using participatory design. And I think can be useful for a wide range of design and kind of creative endeavors when you're working with the public. And finally, I think that actually the theories from learning sciences do have something to contribute back to participatory design, to actually help with designing better activities, to elicit more from your participants than if you're not thinking about these learning and reflective practices. And that's all I have. Are there any questions?
We got like 45 seconds, so if anybody has.
Oh, I thought we had till the end of the hour, sorry.
Oh, yeah, it's 5 till.
Okay.
So, anyone? Shy. In that case? Oh, yeah.
So it seems like participatory design is like a very, very flexible kind of way of getting these sorts of things. And I'm thinking that maybe is it at like the cusp of like kind of creative, just let people do anything, or does it go further as opposed to like the more like here come to a lab and answer these questions and do this particular survey, or what's is there?
So I think it's more structured than, say, if I was doing observations for an ethnography and I just go out and observe the world, right? That's really unstructured. And then a lot of times when people are doing these sort of user studies, it's quite structured. even if they may go see them in their office and see their regular everyday activities and ask them questions along the way, it's this very sort of, well, what else do you need? What else could help you? Participatory design is really creating activities so that they think about their problems in a different way, or they think about their assets in a different way, so that you can leverage those for design.
Sure.
So, I mean, yes, it's certainly out there. It's not.
Cool. All right. Well,
All right.
thank you so much. Don't forget, on Wednesday at 7 o'clock at the garage over by Tech Square near LA Fitness, we have a Women in Music Technology concert, first ever in